BBT University. My today's topic is human resource planning, and in this lecture, I'll be covering topics like concept of human resource planning, what is the process, what are the different factors affecting human resource planning, objectives, and then the internal and the external factors affecting HRP and HRP at the macro and micro level. Now, firstly, as you can see, globalizations around the world, they are facing issues of skills shortages, competency gaps, downsizing, right sizing, job cuts, pay cuts, and so on. And all major organizations, whether they have large-scale operations or small-scale operations, they are going for manpower redundancies in a very phased manner. Now, there are many reasons for HR redundancies, like the knowledge and skill has becoming obsolete over a period of time, then inadequate business plans which lead to the problem of overstaffing and understaffing, then inflexible job descriptions, that is, if the job descriptions are very defined very narrowly, then there is the problem of lateral transfer. The employees, they cannot be relocated to other jobs. Then there is absence of training and development programs. Some organizations do not have a policy of retraining their workforce. But the biggest problem lies with inadequate human resource planning. So manpower planning it involves getting the right number and type of people into the right jobs at the right time to ensure achievement of organizational objectives. So what is human resource planning? That is, you are looking at the number of people and the type of people. So what is the number of people that the organization requires, and what is the type of people that the organization requires, so that these numbers can be projected into the future needs of the organizations, and the organization will have human resources in the right time. That is, when it requires, these human resources are present in the workforce. But this definition has a narrow focus, and it is only looking at the assessment of the number, and more appropriately, HRP can be defined as a strategy for acquisition, utilization, improvement, and retention of human resources. So HRP is looking at balancing the demand and supply of human resources. It is looking at the gap which is in between the demand and supply of human resources, and it ensures that this gap is narrow, there is a balance, and then it is also looking at balancing the distribution and allocation of people so that it does not lead to shortages and surplus of human resources. Then HRP also identifies skill and competency gaps and develops plans for building human resources needed in future. There are certain activities that HRP looks at. First is forecasting future manpower requirements. Now, this forecasting of future manpower can be either done through quantitative tools like mathematical projections, or it can be done using qualitative tools like managerial judgments and so on. Then secondly, the organization has to prepare an inventory of its present manpower. That is, it has to maintain a database of each employee's skills, their abilities, experience, work preference, and other information. And this database, it helps the organization into assessing whether the present workforce can be deployed for meeting the future needs of the organization. Then thirdly, HRP also looks at anticipating problems of manpower. Means it also looks at, it projects the present resources into the future and compares with the forecast of manpower requirements. So this helps in determining whether the present resources, they are adequate in number, and the quality is also up to the mark which is needed for the organization to meet its objectives. Then lastly, meeting manpower requirements. That is, the organization also does activities of building plans. That is, it takes up functions like recruitment, selection, training, development, compensation, and so on to ensure manpower requirements are correctly met. Then manpower planning proceeds a number of steps. For example, first is job analysis. So manpower planning, before going into human resource planning, the organization should do job analysis. So job analysis means it is the process of gathering information about a job, and it leads into two major components, that is job description and job specification. Job description is looking at the content of the job, that is the title, location, physical setting, hazardous, how hazardous the task is, what are the tasks, duties and responsibilities in that job, what is the nature of the operation, and so on. Whereas job specification looks at the employee side, that is the qualities that are required to carry out the tasks. So the training of the employee, the skills, mental capabilities, experience, and so on come under the job specification. So job analysis is necessary for if you are taking up human resource planning. Secondly, some organizations develop work rules, and these work rules, they are determined courses of action in a documented form, and it determines when the work will start, when it will stop, the rest periods, then if there are any issues regarding drinking, fighting, insubordination, or if there is any injury, then these rules, they are looked up in order to take proper action. Then thirdly, application of industrial engineering techniques. Now HRP also requires what kind of work is being done in the organization, what is the best way of doing the task, and how much time a particular task takes. So all this determines human resource planning. Then there are other factors which affect human resource planning, are like your layout. So there are some works that are done in isolation, while others they are done in groups. So layout determines how much space is required for each individual in order to carry out the task. Secondly, the statutory requirements. Now in some situations, or in a factory setup, the need for a welfare officer or a medical officer is required, and these are statutory requirements which have to be fulfilled by any organization. Then shifts, that is whether the work is being carried out in shifts or not, also decides the requirement for manpower. Leave reserve. Now no person can work for the entire year. Employees do take leaves. So when you are determining human resource planning, or when you are doing human resource planning, this has to be taken into consideration, that people take leaves, and so that also will determine the manpower requirement. Now, there are certain objectives of manpower planning. Firstly is to integrate HR planning with organizational planning to ensure best utilization of human resources. So HR planning should be integrated with the plans of the organization. It should not be a standalone task, and that will ensure best utilization of resources. Secondly, it has to ensure that the different manpower policies of different functions, there is a coordination between those manpower policies. And thirdly, surplus or deficiency in staff strength is the result of inadequate human resource planning. So HR planning is again needed to avoid surplus or shortage of staff. Then HR planning also forms the foundation for other HR functions. For example, if you are taking a recruitment, so before recruitment, the organization need to know what type of people are required for the job and how many people are required for the job. Then HRP ensures cost minimization by utilizing human resources in the best way. Then it ensures efficiency of work at all levels, and it also maintains required levels of skills and competencies that are required to meet the needs of the organization. Now, there are certain factors affecting HRP. The internal factors are: first, the type and strategy of the organization. So what type is the organization? Is it a manufacturing organization or a service-based organization? So if it is a manufacturing, organizations are more labor intensive. So the need for human resource planning is more in a manufacturing organization as compared to a service organization where the employees need to be more customer focused. Then the strategy of the organization. So what is the strategy will again determine HRP. If the strategy is to grow organically, that is through mergers and acquisition, so the need for HRP is less in this case as compared to an inorganic growth where the organization is using all its funds and resources to expand its business operations. And secondly, the growth cycle. So at which stage is the organization? Is it in the starting stage or at the growth stage or declining or maturity stage? So human resource planning is most needed during the growth stage when the when the organization is expanding in terms of the number of people required and in terms of its scaling up the operations. Then thirdly, outsourcing. So if the organization is outsourcing some of its peripheral functions, then it needs to do less of human resource planning as compared to an organization that will keep all the functions to itself. Then the type and quality of forecasting information also impacts human resource planning. So the data, the tools and techniques that are being used, if they are not proper, then the data on human resources will also not be accurate, and this will affect the human resource planning process. And lastly, the time horizon, that is for what time period are the human resources needed. So there are some organizations that operate in a very unstable environment, like for example the software industry. So there the short-term planning is more in trend as compared to the organization like university, which is operating in a more stable environment. There the organization can go for long-term plans. Now, some of the external factors that affect HRP are: first, your economy. So the prevailing economic conditions influence human resource planning, and any country where the GDP growth rate is high and it is not impacted by a recession, so the creation of jobs is more, and as compared to a country which has low GDP and is being affected by recession, it means lesser job creation and more of separation programs. Then secondly, the labor market, that means the availability of labor, the kind of labor that is available in the market, the labor participation rate into the workforce, the skill level of the labor, and the skill availability of the labor. All these have direct and indirect impact. So for example, if an organization needs to fill its top position, it has to see the labor market, whether the skill it requires is available in the local market or not. If it is not, then it has to go for pan-India advertisement. Thirdly, the demographic factor, that means what age and what is the gender mix of the working population. This also impacts the human resource planning function. So for example, India and Japan, they face two different challenges. India has it has a young population around the world, and the working age group is in between 18 to 35 years. So this means that more and more generation Y population is present in the workforce, whereas in Japan the working population is aging and they have issues like updating the workforce in latest technology or delaying the retirement process. Then another external factor that impacts HRP is the regulatory framework. So the regulatory framework, it influences HRP in ways if the there are certain laws that the country may follow, and for example, in India, the organizations cannot make distinctions between caste, creed, race, or culture when they are doing hiring. So this impacts the human resource planning practices. Then lastly, we have the social and cultural factors. So issues like work-life balance are in vogue, and organizations have to respond to these issues by increasing workplace flexibility, elderly care, child care, etc. Now coming to the HRP process, the first stage of HRP process is investigation. In this stage, organizations try to develop their awareness about the detailed manpower scenario with a holistic view, looking at their current manpower. So at this stage, the organization, they become aware, or they want to become aware of the manpower scenario in a more holistic way. So the best way is the SWOT analysis, where the organization is considering the external environment and the internal environment, and in that backdrop, it is looking at its strengths and weaknesses. So for external manpower view, the issues at the macro level can be considered, like what are the economic conditions, what is the legal framework in the country where they are operating, and looking at the internal manpower environment, the organization can look at the working practices, the productivity trends, the performance of the people, operational and strategic plans, and so on. So specific requirements in terms of numbers and characteristics of employees must be derived from organizational objectives. So at this stage, the organization, as it gets a detailed manpower scenario, and it looks at the external environment, the internal environment, and its own strengths and weaknesses. So this when projecting the manpower requirement, it also keeps into consideration the organization's objectives that have to be achieved. The second stage is the forecasting stage. Now, when you have investigated the manpower scenario in a very holistic way, the second is the next phase of HRP is the analysis of demand and supply of manpower. So in this stage, the organization is analyzing the demand of manpower, and for making demand forecasts, it can take help of different models or different techniques that are available, and there are different techniques for making HR demand forecasts. So it helps in this demand forecasting, it helps in identifying requirements of manpower for various positions at different points of time. Whereas looking at the manpower supply side, the organization should consider both the internal supply and the external supply. So for internal supply, the organization should also consider the career planning, training, succession planning aspects, along with the corporate policies and procedures. So for the internal supply, for example, if the organization has a policy of promoting people from within whenever there is a vacancy, then it should look at the policy of promotions for what period, at what level the promotion, this particular policy is applicable, or whether the promotion has to follow a certain time period, that is, it is based on seniority, or whether it is based on merit. So such considerations have to be taken in doing the resource planning. Then looking at the external supply. So if the organization is not able to fulfill the position with the internal supply, it looks at the external supply. And external supply considers macro level issues in order to understand whether the kind of people that it needs are available in the market or not. Now the third stage is planning and control of manpower. So at this stage, forecasts of manpower are translated into HR policies and actions. So once you have made the forecast, now you have to translate this into actions. So this relates to all the HRP related issues like recruitment, training and development. All these functions have to be taken up. Now for example, if in balancing or in forecasting the demand of manpower and the supply of its people, the organization sees that it has shortage of manpower and it has to take up recruitment. So then it becomes necessary for the organization to first understand the job description, that is the job for which the recruitment will take place. So the job description has to take place first, and also the time period for which recruitment has to be made. Then most of the times the organizations are also faced with the problem of restructuring. So the extent and scope of internal hiring has to be understood. Then plans are also have to be made regarding training and development policies to address the problem of skill obsolescence in changing environment. Hence, the scope for redeployment through retraining needs to be considered at this stage. Now, while doing HRP, flexibility and interrelationship of all other policies need to be considered. So, many a times the organizations, they have inflexible working conditions, they have inflexible job description, and most organizations also do not have a policy of retraining or reskilling their workforce. So all these aspects have to be considered while doing HRP. Then the controlling of manpower is also necessary at this stage if there are any observed deficiencies. So let's say, for example, the costs of manpower is going high. It is high as compared to the set budgets. So things like the organization can see where the costs are going high. Maybe the VRS, that is the voluntary retirement scheme, is proving to be more costly than reskilling of manpower through training. Or let's say that the organization, if it pays overtime to its employees, falls much more cheaper than hiring a new person. So all these plans have to be undertaken at this stage. Then lastly, the utilization stage. Now in this stage, the HRP process, the success of the HRP process has to be measured in terms of achievement, both quantitatively and qualitatively. So in quantitative terms, the cost of the cost of manpower has to be considered. Then the productivity in trends, the productivity gains have to be seen. And qualitatively, the organization has to see the motivation of the employees, the number of grievances that employees are coming up with, or what is the employer and employee relationship. Then lastly, we look at the macro and the micro human resource planning. So at the macro level, we are looking at human resource planning of a particular nation or country. And development of human resources is very important for any country if it is aiming for long-term economic growth. Now, in India, the government has made the initiatives regarding population control, education, health, housing, and so on. So, for population planning and control, if the population is not controlled, then it leads to unproductive population. So, the government, Indian government, has taken measures like affordable health care, and then quality of life being enhanced by primary and secondary education. Then there is a sanitation, housing facility, transport facility, and empowering of women also has led to bringing down the birth rate. Then the second improvement that can be brought about is through literacy and education. Now, India has a national policy on education, and it is also increasing its expenditure on institutional infrastructure, which has led to uh, growth in literacy rate. Then, thirdly, the health and medical care. Again, the health sector reforms is another initiative for developing human resources at the macro level. Though there are many initiatives being taken, but still India it lacks in controlling communicable and non-communicable diseases. So still more reforms are needed in this particular aspect. Then the housing, again, India has a national policy on housing, and initiatives like smart cities, affordable houses, urban development are also being taken up. So at the micro level, human resource planning, it involves the strategy for acquisition, utilization, development, and retention of human resources at the organization level. So this we have already discussed, that at the organization level, what all the organizations need to do in order to improve their in order to have adequate number and the type of people that they require to achieve the organization's needs.